Never That Safe. Posted by Alma Lazone on subreddit Let's Not Meet. Okay, this happened in 2016 when I was a 17-year-old first-year college student in film school. I'm now 22, female. Name is Julia. I lived alone in my first ever apartment. It was really small, but I was really proud of my independence. I never felt unsafe in this apartment for several reasons. There were multiple gates in the residence that needed to be opened through a code. Only the people who lived there knew. My door had 3 different locks, and it was right next to the university, so most people who lived in the neighborhood were college students. Nothing bad had happened ever in the neighborhood before. I've always been very careful with locking the door when I leave my home. I always check twice. I have slight OCD, so this one time, I leave to go to class, and I lock my door, but for some reason, I couldn't get the key out of the lock. It was completely stuck, so I went to get the caretaker of the building to help me. But he wasn't there, and I was getting late for class, so I went to class with the key still in the lock. I took off the keychain first, so it's not too noticeable. When I got home, the caretaker was back, so he came to help me, and we couldn't get it out for 15 minutes, until somehow he did. He told me the lock was damaged, but that I didn't necessarily need to change it if I only locked it once instead of twice. I just said okay, and that was the end of it. I really wasn't worried because of how safe I felt in this building. Flash forward 2 months later, I was taking out the trash one night around 11 p.m. While on the phone with my sister, I remember telling her that I was taking out the trash. Then, that I would take a shower afterwards before heading to a party. As I previously said, I always lock the door, even just to take out the trash. Because of my lock being damaged, I only locked it once. When I got back to my apartment, I found the door unlocked, which immediately alarmed me. So I went into the apartment and locked the door immediately with 3 different types of locks. When you walk into my apartment, which is just 215 square feet, you have the main room in front of you and the bathroom door immediately to your left. I had left the bathroom door slightly open, enough so I could see a man in my shower turning his back to me. Naturally, when I saw this, I tried to open the door and leave as fast as possible, except my main lock was damaged from 2 months earlier, and I couldn't open it no matter how hard I tried. In this moment, all I could think of was the fact that I had to leave as fast as possible. I jumped out the window without really thinking. I figured it was the only solution, except I lived on the 2nd floor, so I completely smashed my ankles in the landing. I started running whichever way I could, and then I got a little bit further from the building. I looked back, and the man was there at my window, watching me run away. I thought of 2 possible outcomes. Either the man was going to jump and chase me, except I wouldn't get far with my twisted ankles, or he would get scared of the height and be locked in my apartment. Thankfully, he picked option 2. I went to hide in a bush a little further and called the police, who arrived in just 10 minutes because I lived close to the station. They pushed my door open, and the man was just sitting on my couch, holding a kitchen knife, waiting for me to come back. Like, he didn't think I would call the police. They arrested the guy and later told me he had already been arrested for sexual assault, rape, attempted kidnapping, and attempted murder. They also told me how everything had happened. Like I said, it was a very friendly neighborhood with mostly college students, so we got inside the building by other people holding the door for him. He then heard me telling my sister I was going to take a shower, which was why he was waiting for me in the bathroom. He crocheted my lock while I was taking out the trash. He apparently noticed me on the school campus and followed me to my home several times before, succeeding to actually come in. He stayed inside waiting for me because I had recently changed my phone and the previous one was still on the table, so he thought I didn't have a phone with me to call the police. I don't live there anymore, but after that, to get into the building, we all needed identification proving we lived there. Building IDs were created, and we had to scam them every time, and it was the only way to go inside the building. Nothing bad happened in the neighborhood after that. It was back to being very peaceful and friendly. I witnessed a home invasion posted by spaghetti_mercury on subreddit no sleep. My mom asked me to take care of her dog while she was out of town. It's about an hour and a half from home. Her and my stepdad had to go out of town for a funeral. It's for his cousin or his second uncle or something like that. All I know is it isn't someone he knew very well. They just felt obligated to go. Also, it was in Florida and it was late November. Her place is near the Finger Lakes. It's actually on a smaller lake right next to one of the Finger Lakes. It's a nice place, way nicer than my place. I'd been going there every other weekend or so since I was 5. It's a nice place to get away. They had a nice house right on the water, and a pontoon boat and a few smaller fishing boats. The best part of being there, in my opinion, was that there was no cell service. I was always late on technology. I was the last person I knew to get a smartphone. I was about out of high school when they really became commonplace. The reason I enjoyed the lack of service, though, is that serenity and being unreachable. People who knew me know that I don't have service up here. I love that. I always want to ignore texts and calls, but I feel like it's rude. Most people always have their phones nearby. If they don't text you back, they probably don't want to talk to you. I could just blame it on bad service when I was at my mom's. She also didn't have cable. I wasn't fond of that part. She had a VCR and a handful of tapes I had seen 1,000 times. Being there was kind of like going back in time. It was even more like that this time because the house phone was out of commission too. The lines passed through the woods. Falling trees took out their power and phone lines regularly. They didn't even bother trying to get internet for that reason. I loved her dog, too, so taking care of him wasn't even a chore to me. His name was Lou. He's an old man, so he needs some help getting around as well as his medication. He's a good boy, though, and rarely gives me problems. This was going to be a little vacation for me. A week at the lake with the house to myself sounded perfect. I'd been under a lot of stress because I had been laid off from my temp job. I was embarrassed to be unemployed yet again. I always seemed to find seasonal jobs and temp jobs. Being 26 and unemployed wasn't something I was proud of, and everyone I saw would ask me if or where I was working at the time. It annoyed me. Were they expecting to get an interesting conversation from that question? The point is that I was more than ready to get out of town. I got there on Wednesday. It didn't really matter what day it was because the lake is pretty desolate in the fall and winter. During the summer months, there would be parties, fireworks, ladies, good times. A lot of people up there had summer homes or vacation homes. Must be nice when so many are homeless, not only in America, sorry. My mind is all over the place, and I have a bit of a distaste for wealthy people because I'm not. Anyway, I had the house to myself. I had the lake to myself. It sound weird, but I love my alone time. Or time with only dogs, I guess. Left me some supplies. The fridge was full of food and beer, so I was good. My mom also had left me a hefty bag of weed. Don't judge your mom, don't judge mine. She was the secondary parent growing up, so by rule, she had to be the parent that let me drink in my teens and occasionally share a doob. The first night was quiet. They have a nice, big deck overlooking the lake. I sat there and smoked a joint. I peered around the lake with my stepdad's binoculars. He said they were for hunting. I have other theories. Lots of bikinis on the lake. I looked around at mostly empty cottages. The only other one I saw with people there was almost straight across the lake. Their house is on the channel of the lake, so it's only about 60 feet across. A few hundred yards down the lake, it opens up wider. The whole lake isn't all that big. I could take the fishing boat to the end of the channel and see the whole thing. It isn't exactly teeny though. There's a small tunnel to a connecting lake, but they usually took the pontoon when we went out on the lake, and it doesn't fit through the tunnel. A sunset smoke on the deck became a nightly routine while I was up there. I spent most of the day watching TV, playing with the dog, and stuffing my face. I went on a small boat for a few quick rides, but it was cold. It also wasn't fun alone. I found myself looking forward to my evening joint. It was peaceful. It was my 4th night there when it happened. I went out to the deck and lit my joint. I sipped my rum and coke, and as I sat back and stared at the stars, I was feeling very relaxed and just a little gooned up within minutes. I picked up the binoculars and started looking at the cottage across the lake. Most of them were dark and locked up for the winter. I landed on the house across the lake. It was the only cottage in my line of sight with lights on. I could see through the front windows. There was a guy setting out a bowl of chips and refreshments. It was a Sunday, so I assumed they were having people over for the football game. I looked over there every few minutes. There was a man and a woman in the house before a car pulled up. It looked like another couple. Maybe they were swingers. Anyway, I was getting bored watching people wander around their house. I was feeling a bit creepy too. I went inside and gave Lou a snack. Then I used a folded towel to help him get up and walked him outside to do his business. I got him back inside onto his mountain of blankets before giving him another treat. He may be a bit spoiled. I tried to find a movie to watch, but there was nothing I wanted to see for the 100th time. I popped in my headphones, put on some music, and went back out to the deck. I relit the joint I had been smoking earlier and relaxed as I listened to music. I must have dozed off a little. I popped up when the cherry of the joint pricked through my shorts and got to my leg. Jumped up and frantically smacked at the burning ember. It felt like I needed a drink, so I got another couple. It was getting late, but I decided to have a few more before I called it a night. Started to relax again. After a while, I sat back and picked up the binoculars again. I scanned across the dark, empty cottage before I landed on the same one across from me. Through the window, I could see 4 people sitting around a table. It looked like they were playing a board game or something. I really watched for a few minutes. It was pretty boring. I went to put the binoculars down, but I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I brought the binoculars back up. I looked around outside of the house, and there was someone there. It was difficult to make out the figure in the dark, but it was definitely a person. They were dressed in all black and appeared to be looking through the window at the people inside. I watched as another figure walked up to the first one. This one was facing my direction, and I could see their face. Well, what was on their face. I thought it was a mask at first, but when they turned, I could see that it was tape. It was a lot of tape. The other one turned around. They had also had their entire face covered in strips of masking tape. It was beyond creepy. I watched as they appeared to talk to one another before a third person walked over. This one had the same tape job on their face, but with longer hair coming out of it. It looked like 2 men and a woman, but I couldn't be sure. They were all looking through the window at the people inside. I wasn't sure what I should do. Something weird seemed to be happening. Maybe it was friends of theirs pulling a prank. I paced back and forth as I usually do when I'm stressed out. I continuously picked up the binoculars to look back, and every time I did, the tape-faced people were just staring through the windows and walking around the outside of the house. I debated whether to call someone for a few minutes before remembering that there wasn't a house phone. My phone was long dead, and I was at least a mile away from anywhere with service anyway, and didn't have a vehicle. I started to get very nervous. I told myself that I always did this though. The people outside were either pranking their friends inside or something like that. I quietly went back out to the deck. The outside lights was off, so I figured the people across the lake couldn't see me. I listened closely, hoping I could hear the people outside talking. Sound carries over the lake. It makes it feel like someone's right next to you. I heard nothing though. I picked up the binoculars one more time to see what they were doing. I looked around the outside of the house, but couldn't spot the tape-faced people. I looked again at the people inside. The 4 of them were sitting on the couch, presumably watching TV. They were facing towards me. I watched them chat with each other for a minute before things took a turn. As I watched the people on the couch, I thought I saw something move behind them. I think the kitchen was behind them. The light wasn't in that room, so I couldn't see much. I was looking right at the darkened area behind them when someone walked out. It was the largest of the 3 people with taped faces. They didn't notice him at first. He stood behind them and stared at them for about a minute. My heart started pounding as I told myself that it was a prank of some sort. Maybe a late Halloween joke thing? Soon after, I watched one of the other taped faces people run around the front of the house. I could tell that one of the guys on the couch noticed something outside. He stood up and looked closer at the window, still not noticing the large man standing behind them. I watched as they looked around from the window. The second that he turned back around, the man behind the couch struck him with something. The man fell to the ground as his friend started screaming. I could hear the screams clearly from across the lake. The other man stood up, but the tape-faced man pulled out a handgun and pointed it at him. He quickly sat back down. The tape-faced man backed towards the front door, with his gun pointed at the people on the couch. I quickly panicked as I thought about what I could possibly do to help. I didn't want to move. Once the tape-faced man got to the door, he opened it up, and the other 2 sprinted in and leapt on top of the man on the ground and who had been hit. He stabbed him frantically and repeatedly with large kitchen knives. I could see blood splatter on the window next to him. 3 people on the couch screamed in horror as the tape-faced people continued brutally stabbing the man. It went on for several minutes. The 2 who were stabbing the man were covered in blood. The masking tape on their face was completely red by the time they stopped. I stood up and I stared at the remaining people on the couch. I could hear bits and pieces of what the people on the couch were screaming. They pled for tape-faced intruders to leave. The intruders seemed to just stare at them. I couldn't tell if they were speaking. I wanted to run inside, but I couldn't quite make my body move. I was petrified. I kept still and kept watching these weirdos staring at the friends, at the person they had just mutilated. The man jumped up off the couch and put his hands up as he pleaded with the intruders to stop. The large intruder put the gun to the man's forehead. The man slowly dropped to his knees. The other 2 intruders began walking in circles around him as the large intruder kept the gun on him. They circled around him over and over. They were almost dancing as they walked around him. Finally, one of them stopped behind him. It was the one with the long hair, who had appeared to be a female. She stood behind him for a moment, then jumped down to her knees. She moved her face close to the man's like she was whispering something in his ear. Then she quickly slit his throat. It happened so quickly. She held the man's head back up by his hair as blood exploded from his neck. That's when I vomited. I puked all over the porch and tried not to scream. I slowly made my way to the door and went into the house. I wanted to turn off any lights that might make it look like someone was home. The TV wasn't the main thing I was worried about. I took Lou into the spare room where I slept when I stayed there. I didn't want him to bark and alert those psychos that someone was home. I gave him a bunch of treats to keep him occupied. I went back over to the door, to the deck. I peered around the corner, but couldn't make out what was happening across the lake. I quickly opened the sliding door and sat down on the floor of the deck. I grabbed the binoculars and looked through the spaces in the railings. First thing I saw when I looked through the window of the house across the lake was a woman hanging in the living room. She was covered in blood and dangling from a beam. She looked like she had also been stabbed. I was disgusted. I looked around for the other woman, but didn't see her. I tried to keep my hands steady as I scanned the house looking for the other woman. I looked through every window I could see from the deck and saw nothing. I started looking around the yard. I was frantically searching. I moved the binoculars from the yard to the dock, and there was one of the tape-faced intruders staring back at me. It was the female one. I just froze at the sight of the blood-soaked masking tape. I stared for a second before she started waving at me. She saw me. My heart sank. I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. I ran into the house. I got to the window and looked back over through the binoculars. By the time I spotted her again, one of the others was standing there with her. They were both looking right at me. Didn't know what to do, so I just watched them. I ran to my stepdad's room to see if I could find his gun. I didn't find it. Anxiety wouldn't let me stray too far from the window where I could see the tape-faced people. When I got back to the window and looked back over, all three of them were looking over at me. I kept the binoculars on them. I figured that if I lost sight of them, my heart would pop from fear. All of a sudden, two of them jumped off the dock and into the lake. I was shocked. The water must have been freezing cold. They began swimming over as the largest of the group grabbed the canoe leaning against the house and started dragging it towards the lake. I panicked. I ran through the house and locked all the doors. I frantically searched again for my stepdad's gun, but the only thing I could find was half of a torn apart hunting rifle. It was clearly only the stock of the gun and most likely wouldn't even slow an intruder down. I had the house locked up, so I ran to the window to see where the intruders were. I looked along the channel and didn't see any of them. I looked across the lake and saw the large one walking out of the house towards the lake. I looked towards the shoreline on my side and watched as one of them walked out of the water and onto the shore. It must have been 30 or 40 degrees out. I have no idea how they could stand the cold water. I ran to the bookcase and dragged it in front of the door to the spare room. It fell as I tried to walk it over, so I pushed it into the door. I was probably going to need to run soon, and I knew Lou wouldn't be able to keep up, so I wanted to barricade the room. Once I was done with that, I ran to the window and looked outside again. I saw the female intruder in the yard. She was standing there, motionless, for a minute or two before she started to dance. It was a strange kind of interpretive dance. It was bizarre. I looked across the lake again to see the big one getting into the canoe that was now in the lake. I looked back over to the woman dancing. She was twirling around like a ballerina. Then she abruptly stopped. That very moment, something came crashing through the glass kitchen door. I immediately started running to the other end of the house. I went for the basement. The basement door had a padlock on the inside, so it felt more secure. I also figured I was more likely to find a weapon or something to defend myself down there. I made my way through the dark, cluttered basement. There was a light on the stairs, but it was still hard to see down there. Even when the light was on, I could hear footsteps upstairs. Every step sent shivers up my spine. I could hear Lou barking. I prayed that they would leave him alone. He didn't bark for long, but it was long enough to let them know where he was. I searched the basement for a weapon. I thought it would be easier than it was. I ended up finding a hammer. I guess the shovels and saws were outside in the shed. I looked for a corner where I could stay and be able to see in every direction in front of me. That's when I noticed yet another thing that horrified me. The house had those rectangular ground level windows that a lot of basements have. The windows never got put in though. There was just boards propped up over the two openings where the windows would eventually go. I remember being younger and thinking about how easy it would be to break in through there. The board had been moved from one of those openings. I looked around in panic, thinking that one of the intruders was in the basement with me. Either that or they were surrounding me. I heard the footsteps upstairs stop near the basement door. I held the hammer tight as I tried to quietly move through the basement. I slowly made my way to the window opening. I was almost to it when I heard the basement door open. I spun around and looked towards the door. When I looked back, one of the intruders was crouched down outside the window, looking inside. I jumped back as they started crawling in. I headed towards the other opening on the other side of the basement. I could see the intruder who came in through the basement door, reaching the bottom of the stairs. The other opening was in the very darkened spot. I think the intruders lost sight of me as I approached it. I was afraid to move the board and give away my location. I could see one of the intruders. I could hear the other one bumping into things as they moved their way around through the cluttered basement. The one I could see was at the opposite end of the basement. The one I could hear was getting dangerously close to me. I held perfectly still as they made their way around the support beam a few feet away from me. I could see their shadow moving in front of me at that point. My heart was beating so hard that I worried they would hear it. I needed to move that board in front of the window hole and climb through it, but I worried that it would alert them and I wouldn't have enough time to get through it before they caught me. As one of the intruders passed in front of me, just a few inches away, I panicked and hit him in the head with a hammer. They made a quick gasp and dropped to the ground. The hammer stuck in their head. I grabbed the board from the window. I could see the other intruder heading toward me. I pulled myself up through the window hole. As I pulled my legs from the opening, I heard the intruder inside scream. It was the female intruder, and she had just found her friend with a hammer in his skull. Friend? Coworker? Whatever they were to another. They were close enough to set her off. I could hear her throwing things and yelling as I got myself to my feet and started running towards the woods out back of the house. I looked back to see the female intruder climbing out of the opening. I sprinted as fast as I physically could, hoping to reach the woods before she got up. I wanted to reach them without her seeing where I went in. I reached the wood line. It was all on a hill, so I ran uphill already out of breath. My stomach burned as I forced myself to keep running. By the time I stopped for a breath, I had lost track of where the intruder was. I ran until I couldn't anymore. I sat down against a tree and tried to quiet my breathing enough to listen for the intruders. After a few minutes of hyperventilating, I looked down the hill toward my mom's house. It was dark and I couldn't see much. I listened closely for movement and didn't hear anything, so I sat down and tried to rest up in case I needed to run again. I sat still against that tree for what felt like an hour. I had no way of knowing the time. I decided to head down and check empty cottages along the road for a phone. There was nothing but woods and fields for miles at the top of the hill, so I headed back toward the lake. I moved slowly through the woods, trying to be as quiet as possible. I reached the edge of the woods without incident. I came out behind a cottage that was 2 down from my mom's. I waited there and scanned the area for the intruders for a few minutes. I saw no sign of them, so I headed to the cottage. I knew that they kept a key under a rock near the front door. I found it and let myself in. I moved cautiously through the house. I couldn't see much in the dark, so I felt around. It took me a while to tiptoe to the living room. I reached around the table until I felt a phone. It was pitch black in the living room. I picked up the phone, but there was no dial tone. I tried to hang it up and try again, but there was nothing. I felt along the cord until I reached the severed end. The wire had been cut. Almost at the exact moment I realized the wire had been cut, I saw something jump out and swing at me. The knife cut into my shoulder. The pain and the shock hit me simultaneously. I ran to the door. I don't know how I did it, but I reached out as I was running, and I was able to grab a small but heavy statue from the coffee table. Still running, I turned and whipped it at the intruder. She yelled when it hit her. It slowed her down, but didn't stop her. I was able to get outside and slam the door behind me. I kicked over the bench by the door, which was just enough to slow her down some more. I was able to get away and started running down the road toward my mom's house. I felt relief as I closed in on the house and could hear Lou barking from inside. My relief quickly faded when I spotted the large intruder walking around the backside of the house. I instinctively ran the other direction, which was toward the lake. That's when I spotted the canoe tied to my mom's dock. I jumped in so fast that I almost flipped it. I untied the rope and started rowing to the other side of the lake. I felt home free. Then a bullet hit me. The large intruder was shooting at me. The first shot is the same arm that had been stabbed. He shot again. I watched it hit the water right next to the boat. I was about halfway across when he shot the third time. This one, again, hit the water. Without much thought, I dove into the cold water. I tried to dive down and swim across as deep as I could. When I surfaced, I was almost to the dock. The intruder fired another shot that almost hit me, but barely missed. I pulled myself onto the dock and sprinted toward the house. He fired one more shot, which missed me. It hit the front window of the house, shattering it. I ran into the house. The bodies of the people who lived there were still hanging from the beam. I ran into the kitchen and grabbed the house phone. I was almost surprised when I heard a dial tone. I was able to call the police and explain what had happened. They asked me to stay on the line and wait for them, but I wasn't able to sit there and wait for the intruders to find the paddle boat on the side of my mom's house and come back for me. I grabbed a large knife from the kitchen drawer and headed out the back door. I crept around the house to look for the intruders. I couldn't see them. I turned and ran up the long driveway behind the house. I reached the road at the top of the driveway. Like the other side, there wasn't much other than the woods and empty cottages. I ran to the woods and straight through the thick bush. I ran until I couldn't make myself run anymore. I sat against a large tree and stayed there all night. I was in almost a catatonic state, paralyzed by fear. I watched the sun come up the following day. I wondered if the intruders were still out there looking for me. I had no idea what time it was when I finally got up and started walking towards civilization. I just knew the sun had been up for hours. I finally made it out of the woods as the sun started to set. I was exhausted. I felt relief when I noticed the gas station in the distance. I walked over and went inside. The cashier looked shocked when he saw me. I asked to use the phone. He told me he had to go to his office to grab it. While I waited for him, I noticed my reflection in the mirror of the sunglasses display. I was covered in blood. No wonder the cashier gave me such a weird look. There was a young couple in the store when I walked in. I saw them looking at me and whispering too. When they saw me, they headed to the exit. As they left, I heard one of them say, "Yeah, that's him." They quickly walked to their car and left without pumping gas. I started getting impatient. The cashier was still in the back. How long did it take to grab a phone? I walked over to the back room to knock when I heard sirens. 3 cop cars pulled into the parking lot. I felt so relieved. I walked outside to tell the police what had happened. The second I walked out the door, several cops drew their guns. I was confused. They yelled at me to get on the ground. I complied. I didn't understand why they were cuffing me. I thought it was because I was covered in blood. I tried to explain what happened, but they kept telling me to shut up. They took me to the station, where I repeatedly told them what happened. They didn't believe me. I was arrested on 4 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts for the people they found in the cottage across the lake, and 1 count for the intruder in my mom's basement. The other woman I saw in the cottage across the lake wasn't accounted for. Neither were any of the intruders aside from the dead one they found in the basement. They didn't believe that he was an intruder. They didn't believe any of my story. They think I taped his face myself to make him look like a scary intruder so I could claim self-defense. They think I either injured myself or sustained injuries from my victims trying to defend themselves from me. I've been sitting in jail, waiting for my first court appearance. It's a big story in the area. I started receiving fan mail, but most of it from psychos who think I'm guilty. I did receive 1 letter from an anonymous person who claims that they know a friend of the people who were killed across the lake. The letter said she hung out with weird people who claimed to be part of a cult. They suspected that she was the other woman at the cottage who the police can't account for. They believe that she was in on the murders. I showed the letter to the police and they dismissed it as a lie from a disturbed fan of mine. I showed it to my lawyer who thought it was interesting, but wouldn't help us because there was no proof of the claim. Sarah said that it could go either way at this point. She said confident things, but she didn't sound confident saying them. There was a lack of physical evidence other than a roll of masking tape found in my mom's house. I find it insane that it's being considered as legitimate evidence. It's not an uncommon thing to find in any household. I learned this morning that the canoe from the night belonged to a neighbor a few houses down on my mom's side of the lake. That didn't bode well for me. The prosecution's theory is that I stole the canoe and used it to get across the lake, killed 3 people, and rowed the canoe back. They think that I didn't know that the 4th person there, according to them. He pursued me shortly after, slains in the cottage. He tried to avenge his friends, and I killed him with a hammer. Now, they know the canoe belonged to someone on the side of the lake. They're going to argue that I would have to go across the lake before anyone could come to my side. I find their theory very far-fetched. They even claim that I threw the guy from the basement into the lake after I killed him, but pulled him back out when he didn't sink immediately. They think that more plausible than swimming across to kill me after realizing that I witnessed their murders. I also asked my lawyer about the neighbor's house. I was attacked there, and the prosecution apparently believes that I trashed the house myself to make it look like there was a struggle. They say that the only evidence there is a mess and a cut phone line. They claim I cut the phone line to support my lie about not having access to a phone. A big part of their case is that I waited a full day and never contacted the authorities. They can't believe that I didn't have access to a phone for a full day, even though I spent the night in the woods. They claim that I wouldn't have turned myself in if I wasn't caught. They don't know what I went through. They don't know how petrified being hunted can make you. I saw what those psychos did to the people. I ran as much as I could, but my body can only take so much. When I was asked for yet another statement, I requested that this one be made public. For legal reasons, I need to add that I did not condone violence against anyone, including the local police. My story has not changed because it's the truth. I just want the world to know the truth. I want my family to know the truth. I'm asking anyone who might know something about the intruders or the victims to please come forward. Even though there is no real evidence against me, it feels like no one believes me. Even my lawyers seem skeptical. Real murders are still out there. That's what scares me the most. It scares me more than the idea of life in prison. I was reminded of that this morning. My trial begins tomorrow, and at this point, it seems that it could go either way. I wish I had more sane people in my corner, but I know that I'm innocent. I've received a lot of strange letters since I've been in here, but I got one this morning that shook me. It was a folded piece of red construction paper with "Rooting for You" written on the front in pencil. It was sloppy, like a toddler had written it, or like someone wrote it with their left hand to avoid potential of handwriting experts being able to identify who wrote it. On the inside it said, "We hope you win, we miss you." It was written in strips of masking tape. They're still out there, and I'm in here. I'm thankful for my internet access and the ability to tell my side of the story. It's the true story. I can only hope that someone, somewhere, knows who these people are. Until then, all I can do is hope for the best. Wish me luck. I'll update when I can. P.S. Lou is okay and living a pampered life at my mom's house. So, silver lining. I witnessed a home invasion posted by spaghetti_Mercury on subreddit No Sleep. An encounter with the unexplained, posted by SpiderTuber6766. So, this is my personal experience. It has only happened once, and never again, but I'll never forget it. It was 4 years ago in 2018. It was a school night, as I was having trouble sleeping. I usually take a while to fall asleep, but this was like I physically couldn't sleep. So I decided to go use the bathroom. I browsed on the phone, on the toilet, and just went along with my business. The way the house was structured was there was a small hall connecting 2 rooms in the rest of the house. So when I walked back to the room, I look out the hall to the kitchen as I see it. In the kitchen was a glowing light, as it was a rectangle shape floating, as it surrounded by a black mass of smoky substance. Now at first, I thought it was my fridge, but it was on the wrong side of the kitchen. Then I started to think of other reasons as it stared right at me. We kept eye contact for a minute, as I was so scared I didn't even think of filming with the phone. But I couldn't be staring all night. I need sleep, and school is tomorrow, so I make a run for my room. As I shut the door, I feel it at the door, as it closed the big distance of the house in just a second. I didn't even lock the door. I didn't care, and just jumped in bed and hid under my sheets. Next thing I knew, it was inside my room. I didn't even hear the door open. It floated above my bed as it breathed down my neck. It soon laid in bed with me, as I was petrified to move. The next morning, it was gone, as I slept with that thing all night. I tell my family and friends, as my mother told me, it was a guardian angel. I'm still not sure what I saw. My rational explanation, I was just tired. I was hallucinating because of it. It wasn't a dream or sleep paralysis, because I was moving and awake. I had another small experience with the same being as it slept in my bed again, as I just didn't try to do anything, and the next morning it was gone again. Haven't seen or felt it since. My brain thought it was the shape of a human with a long black body, and the light was its face. If you know what I saw, please tell me, because I will not let this rest. I know what I saw was a real being. We were both aware of each other. We both knew we saw each other, so I must know. Was it a ghost, a shadow person, an alien, angel or demon? Whatever it was, I'm just glad it was friendly. Posted by _chaoses. The Ford F-150. This happened about 5 years ago. I was around 16, 17 years old. I always enjoyed walking. I would spend at least 1 hour a day walking the roads around where I live. One day, I was out doing my normal route, walking down my street that my house was on, taking a right out to the main street and following it until I got to the end. There, I would cross the crosswalk and retrace my steps to go home. On this particular day, I was about 20 feet from where I would leave the main road on my journey back home. I had my headphones in, blasting music, as always, which can be a bad habit, as I am young, female, that has been put in some sketchy situations while going for my walks. Men chasing me, following me, etc. But since it was daylight, and the roads were pretty busy, I figured it was safe. But man, was I ever off with that assumption. As I was about to pass the entrance of the side street before leaving the main road, a black Ford F-150 pulled up. He stopped and gestured for me to walk in front of him, so I do so. I was going on my merry way when I barely heard someone trying to talk to me. I turned down my music, taking out my headphones as I looked to see the man in the black Ford still stopped at the entrance of the side of the road. I looked at him puzzled, trying to figure out if he was talking to me. I pointed at myself and he grinned, nodding. "What's a beautiful girl like you doing out here?" he asked. I laughed awkwardly. Walking?" I replied, seeing the answer should have been obvious. "It's a beautiful day for that," he commented, just seeming to make small talk. "Yeah," I started before going to turn around and continue my route. "Wait!" the man called. I stopped and turned around, just trying to be polite. Even though the encounter was odd, I didn't see too many red flags. The man then went off saying things such as, "You're so beautiful, you know you have a really nice body, this hot weather is nice for a hot girl." I grew incredibly uncomfortable at this point, seeing as this man had to be in his mid-40s. He had a bit of a receding hairline with black hair, a nose with a protruding bridge, blue eyes that were surrounded by slight wrinkles, and was dressed in a dress shirt. So I instantly brought up my age, saying, "I'm a minor. There has been multiple times I've been mistaken for being older than I was," hoping saying this would get his fully grown adult ass back off. But he didn't. "Oh, that's okay. Come here, sweetheart. Get in the truck." That's when I started panicking. Red flags shooting up everywhere. Stranger danger. I laughed nervously, looking at the cars around me to see if anyone was noticing what was happening. Nobody did. "No, that's fine. My house isn't far." "No, really. Get in the truck. I'll bring you home." "No, come on. Just get in here with me," he called as I turned and started walking away. I was hoping he'd just drive off somewhere else, but he didn't. Instead, he drove extremely slow, following me, complimenting me, and trying to pressure me into his truck. I thought fast of multiple options for different scenarios, but I chose one, a simple one. I pulled my phone out while still walking. I lifted it up to my ear, pretending to loudly answer a call. "Hey, Dad? Yeah, no, I'm just on the enter street name here. I'll be home in about 10 minutes. I stopped pretending to listen to reply, "Okay, you're outside, waiting for me? Awesome, yeah, we can do that when I get back. Love you." After he heard me say that, he took off, tires screeching. I ran back home and made it back within about 6 minutes, actually calling my dad on the way, who made a call to the police, who showed up shortly after and took my statement and description. Turns out there was a man on the loose in my area who was exposing himself to minors and trying to pick up a sexual act, but they never actually found out who it was. So creepy, man. In the black Ford F-150, let's not meet again. Bus robbery. Posted by COVID is gay on subreddit Let's Not Meet. So I used to live in southeast London, and I went to a very terrible secondary school. I just finished my day and was waiting for my bus. I sat on the seat halfway on the left side of the bus. This is important for future reference. I'm peaceful and minding my own business. It's a bright sunny day and the bus is quite packed, and everybody looks so disconnected and lost in themselves, myself included. I'm in my own world. Suddenly, this fat white guy, who is ghetto, walks in. It looks like he's by himself, casually walking towards my side, and I have my bag on the opposite seat to indicate basically, don't be sitting there. He sits on the seat rather promptly, and me being totally ignorant and unaware, just sorta don't pay attention to him. Suddenly, his hand goes into my pocket, and he puts my iPod into his pocket so swiftly. Again, I don't understand my mentality here, so I'm blissfully unaware. I put my iPod back in my pocket so innocently, and then the situation takes a turn for the worse. A guy, frantically from the seat behind me, appears, and he has a hold of my hood of the coat, and he just looks absolutely evil. He is mixed race, and his eyes look completely black, and I'm guessing he's a mix of English and like Iraqi. He is batshit unstable and is threatening to stab me. He is loud and obvious, and the robbery is happening in front of lots of ignorant and indifferent, selfish Londoners. Why nobody said anything is beyond me. All I remember is a black lady looking at me with big, round, scared-looking eyes, but does and says nothing. The guy behind me is doing all the talking. I wasn't even previously aware of this guy. There were also two at the back, monitoring the situation. I actually am calm in this situation. He wants a phone from me. I tell him I don't have a phone. He keeps demanding and the guy beside him tells him to calm down, but is whispering. The guy behind me is then saying, "Don't get off the bus, you will get stabbed if you do." He then is demanding money, and I say I don't have much. I give him a few pounds. He still is incredibly unstable, crazy, and all over the place. Seems like a heroin addict or something. Well, the other guy acts like it's some kind of covert operation. I miss my stop, and I'm scared to get off. Understandably, I get off at the next stop, but before I do, I turn around, and this is in front of lots of people. I don't understand what the fuck everyone else was doing. I say, "Give me my fucking iPod back," I plead. And I don't understand how the bus driver, hearing what I said, doesn't give a shit. I shouted again. The ghetto white guy who is beside me says, "Get the fuck off the bus." The guy in the back suddenly seems non-existent. I stumble out of the bus. I just ran home crying, and my dad comforts me, and we go out to find them, but we don't succeed. This is something that has caused significant mental health and emotional damage to my life. I developed agoraphobia afterward and struggled to leave the house for a few months. I became resentful, fearful, and mistrusted people. I had severe anxiety issues and still do to this day. I'm even crying now writing it. It was obvious, some kind of gain thing, trying to rob someone to get money for drugs. Just never forget the lack of care or thought everyone else had on that bus. My dad is a chair. The title doesn't lie. My dad is a chair, to be specific. He's a fully upholstered, bright orange, angel accent living room chair. The kind with the wooden legs you'd find in any three-piece suit from the 70s. He's pretty comfortable. Truth be told, a little lumpy in places, but his padding is soft. Warm too. He's always warm. There's also telltale ba-thump, ba-thump, ba-thump coming from his back cushion, a steady rhythm at my lumbar to remind me I'm sitting in no ordinary chair. He wasn't always a chair, until last year. He was Kevin, the accountant. He was 51, slightly overweight, generally seemed to enjoy life as a human. He was married to my mom. He still is, but well, as you can imagine, it's a little complicated now. It was funny at first. He came home from work one day and just sat in the corner of the living room. When we'd ask him, why is he sitting on the floor and not the $4,000 cream leather couch, he'd just smile and say, "It feels right here." It stopped being funny the morning he didn't go to work. Turns out he hadn't slept the night before. He'd been watching a movie with my mom, but hadn't gone with her to the bed. She left him sitting in his spot, unsuspicious of the "I'm not tired, I'll be up a little later" lie. She and I both begged him to get up, but he refused to move. Phoned in sick at work, the whole deal. Just spent the day sitting on the floor in his corner. We kept asking him what's wrong, why he wouldn't get up except to use the bathroom. And he just kept saying, no, this feels right. Mom phoned the doctor around the third day of this. He stopped eating or drinking, you see, stopped getting up to use the bathroom too. Surprisingly though, there weren't as many accidents as you would think. Once he allowed the last of the food and drink to leave him, it seemed to stop coming. We also didn't hear his belly growl, despite going a day and a half without food. The doctor couldn't make sense of it. The first guess was that it was psychosomatic, but that wouldn't explain the absence of digestive activity exposed by the stethoscope. They said they'd be back to take some blood samples in a few days. They liaised with some colleagues. Unfortunately, as I said, this was last year, 2020. We never heard back from the doctor, thanks to the virus that shall not be named, I guess. Guy with no troubles who refuses to move is low on the priorities list during a global pandemic. Somehow, Mom managed to wrangle long-term sick leave with Dad's company. Decades of loyal employeeism, combined with Mom's attendance of every company barbecue and softball game, helped Mr. Bannerfrag by the unexplained stomach concern requiring hospitalization excuse. I'll never forget that phone call. At the time, Dad losing his job was the worst case scenario for both of us. He'd always been the breadwinner. Neither of us could support ourselves without him. We'd lose the house in under a year. Dad didn't seem too perturbed my mom's frantic pacing or the lies she warmed through the phone to Mr. Benefrag. He just stared at the wall, serenely, hovering his butt half a foot from the carpet, balancing with his legs bent and his hands flat on the ground behind him. That night, I fell asleep listening to my mom yelling at Dad. He never yelled back. We started noticing the physical changes a few days later. That's when we realized he wasn't psychosomatic. Unfortunately, our shitty, best insurance deal on the market doctor wasn't picking up the phone. We'd get passive-aggressive emails informing us they were waiting to hear back from colleagues, but that was it. This was not good, especially not when the joints in Dad's arms and legs had fused. The not goodness of the doctor's silence increased 1,000-fold when we sent photos of Dad's hands and feet flaking off like discarded spider husks the following week. Did the response change? No. We got very snippy email about shortages on ICU wards and the critical international situation. Mom's shouting match with the chief of medicine, the one she demanded her way up the phone chain to speak to, didn't change things. We were on our own. Mom spent all her time in the living room with Dad. I'd help her wash him, try to make him eat, talk to him when she'd tire out, and fall asleep on the rug. Every day after his routine brought with it new changes in Dad's body. It started with his limbs, as you can probably guess. When his hands and feet fell off, there was no blood. They flaked apart, crusty and dry and brittle throughout. Even the bones of his toes and fingers had the density and consistency of dead skin. The wrists and ankles they left behind were smooth and hard. It was difficult to tell whether we were looking at flesh or exposed bone. The dark, shining surface seemed to blend into his normal arm at the base of the stumps. This discoloration would rise further up his limbs daily, and before long, I woke to see Dad's head and torso fused to the wooden chair, legs supporting my weight while I write this. I use the term Dad's head and torso in the loosest possible sense. By the time his limbs were completely replaced, the rest of him had undergone a slow, harrowing transformation of its own. His shoulders and arms attached to them descended lower and lower. They found the final resting place at Dad's pelvis, sat squarely behind his rigid legs. The chest area they left behind had its own problems. Day by day, Dad's neck retracted further inwards. It didn't stop when his jaw met his collarbone either. It pulled Dad's head deep into his ribcage. His face flattened as the skull supporting it sank, forcing his eyes to point in the opposite directions. Eventually, they slid down to where his nipples once lay, resting glassily and vacant on his pecs. The change wasn't even quick enough to break his jaw, though. Instead, it bent outward, its hinges spreading wide across Dad's broad chest. Each morning, I'd find Mom sobbing over a fresh, unnecessary piece of himself he'd discarded. Hair, ears, nose, his thinny, all of them flaked off and crumbled to dust in her hands. He lost the ability to speak as his head withdrew. Unsurprising though, right? He made the intentions clear before he went. The last words he ever said to me, "Don't cry, I'm a chair, always was a chair, happy as a chair." That was the worst part, I think, knowing that whatever the fuck was happening to Dad, he wasn't resisting it. That when he'd got the initial urge to sit in the corner and not get up, he didn't fight it. That he was happy this way. The implication of being that when he was human. When he was father and husband and accountant, he wasn't. Sadly, I still don't know why or how Dad became a chair. I didn't post any photos, you see. Mom wouldn't let me. Didn't want the embarrassment. Wanted to keep Dad's dignity intact. Thing is, I agreed with her, and kinda still do. I'm glad I didn't go to the socials with pics of Dad at various stages of his journey. The temptation was there to see if anybody could help. Nobody could have though. Could they? Dad would have become just another internet circus freak. I've done enough research and digging over the months to know that whatever happened to Dad, he's the only one. Well, almost only. Mom's own changes started around the time Dad's skin was rethreading into orange fabric and his eyes had hardened into plastic buttons. Her change was a little different. It started in her torso, stretching her day by day, while she remained in a crab pose. I must say, she makes a great couch. Her transformation may have been a little more distressing, but the end result is better. Sorry, Dad. It is what it is. I think the worst part with Mom was the despondency. Dad was so serene as he changed. Mom, though? Mom wouldn't stop weeping. Quiet sobs, tears that fell for a few days, even after her own eyes had become flat plastic. She wasn't crying because of the change, though, I think. I think it was because she wouldn't get to see how beautiful I'll look when I go through my own metamorphosis. Thing is, I get it now. Dad was right. He was a chair. Mom was a couch. I am a coffee table. I always was. Was scared at first when I realized. The truth hit me like a piano dropped from the Empire State Building. I was scrubbing the last of Mom's remaining human skin when it struck through every bone in my raw body, just as it must have done. both Dad and Mom. Spent the whole night sitting on Dad, tears falling down my cheeks, staring at my spot. I didn't want it to be true. I screamed for it not to be, more than once. I could have denied the facts. I knew deep down, to my bones, though. That spot, the space on the rug in front of chair Dad and couch Mom, is for me. It's mine, where I belong. Unlike blissfully accepting Dad and weeping resigning Mom, I fought it for a few days. I'm not them. I'm only 17. I've had dreams, ambitions, goals. I wanted to go to college, settle down, marry some lucky guy, be a mom. I wasn't ready to give up my human form. I spent my nights begging for more time. Nothing answered. The urges didn't abate. My awareness of reality now, the illusions, had been swept away, was too great. When I have slept this last week or so, my dreams have always been the same. I dreamt of true reality, of how I now know things should be. I dream of me, in my place, my body elongated and wooden and flat as right, as is correct, as is natural. I have long, blissful slumbers filled with the feeling of hot ceramic mugs on my tabletop and thick carpet beneath my four legs. I can't fight it anymore. Posting this here, but also printing it out to leave as a note for the removal guys. I want them to be careful with us when the bank repossesses the house and we end up in storage. Please keep us together, if you can. We're a set. Dad's sick leave ended months ago. As you can imagine, the foreclosure notices have been piling up. I stopped caring about the pile of mail under the door around the time that Mom's ribcage split and flattened into her own pinstrip velvet upholstered back. I haven't been hungry in days or thirsty. I'm not even sure if I'm breathing now. I think about it, I'm still scared, but I've come to accept that this is the way things have to be. I don't know why, they just do. Maybe it's a curse. Maybe this house is buried on some ancient ritual site. Maybe it's just some freak anomaly of physics. Who knows? Whatever the reason, I have to suck it up and accept the way things are. This body, this walking wobbly mass of skin and bone and ghibli bits that I love so much, isn't right. It isn't mine. I'm not meant for it anymore. Once I post this and print the copy for the removal guys, I'm gonna get in my spot. Then it's just a case of closing my eyes and waiting. I can already feel my limbs pulling inward, my thighs and upper arms sliding to where they'll meet at my navel in a few days. There's a tugging on the back of my knees, where they'll bend in on themselves, and all 20 of my fingers and toes grow number with each hour that passes. Do I have any regrets? Thousands. There's so much I'll never get to do, to see, to go, to be. I can't hide from the truth though, not anymore. I am a coffee table. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommates that even the drug dealers in my city were playing. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park, quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to waltz, but he finished each box with odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass by me. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open, wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back and then stopped dead in my track. He had stopped dancing and was standing standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again. I kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The streets and the sidewalk ahead were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had to move fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took a giant, exaggerated tiptoe steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point, I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray, or my cell phone, or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling, his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it on my own voice, and that only made me more afraid, but he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance walking away, just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side of the road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see a stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months. After that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. Posted by blue_title, a terrifying encounter with the smiling man. Posted by Excuse You H. What? On Let's Not Meet. I apologize in advance since I'm not a good writer, but I'll do my best to share my experience. To better paint the picture, here's a description of myself at the time of this incident, 3 years ago. 5'5", 26-year-old woman, medium length, bleach blonde hair, curvy, 175 pounds, wearing black, high-waisted tights and a pink crop top. 3 years ago, I was walking home late at night from my friend's house. It was dark, and at the time, I lived in a rough part of a large city. I've had many sketchy situations that I have gotten myself out of, so I guess I felt sort of invisible, like nothing truly could happen to me. When I walk alone, I always stay very alert and aware of my surroundings for my own safety, just in case. About halfway home and roughly 10 minutes to my apartment, I noticed a van started tailing me. I was used to this, since in my city, it's very common for a young woman in a rough area to get propositioned for sex. It's embarrassing how desensitized to this I was. I did my usual and crossed the road so that I would be walking beside traffic, heading in the other direction. I wasn't scared, I was just annoyed. The van then turned on a side street, then back onto the road I was on, and pulled up to me. At this point, I still wasn't scared. Again, this has happened to me so many times, and it never mattered if I was wearing something that showed more skin or if I was wearing a winter coat zipped from just below my chin all the way down to my ankle. That area is notorious for that type of activity. I decided firm and told the person sternly, I'm not interested. I noticed there were 2 men in the van. They looked almost identical. It may have been twins or brothers. Both men had a very, very dark complexion, dark eyes, short dark hair. The van didn't move. I was super annoyed and crossed the road again to get away. At this point, I figured this could be enough for them to stop following me. They didn't. They kept circling back every time I crossed the road. I've never had to put that much effort into getting a horny pervert to leave me alone. So this was when I started to feel unsafe. They zipped by me at the speed the traffic was flowing in, and I yelled for them to F off. I thought it finally worked. It had been 3 minutes, and I hadn't seen the van, so I thought I was in the clear. Just in case, I pulled my phone out and was getting ready to call my sister that I live with. Just then, the van pulled up to me very quickly, and before I could even blink, blink, one of the men jumped out of the van, opened the back door, and approached me quickly in an aggressive manner, as if he was about to scoop me up and throw me into the vehicle. The traffic in that area is very inconsistent. It was dead, and I imagine that is what they were waiting for. Just as the man was about to place his hands on me, I tilted my phone and said, "You are being filmed in my live video chat." I gave my friends your license plate number and the police have been notified. I was so scared, but I didn't let that show. I stayed as calm as I could. The man paused. He was considering if I was bluffing or telling the truth, so I tilted the phone more as to give the fake audience a better look at him. He then jumped into the van and then sped off. Jeez. The post continues. I have never been the same since that night. I'm afraid of walking alone now, even in the daytime. Stay safe out there. Two creeps in a van. Let's never meet. I hope karma finds you both soon. Originally posted by Excuse You H. Watt. Posted by the Rifleman _ of 96, and it goes as following. First off, I like to think of myself as a scientifically minded individual. I try to find any possible explanation for something before I immediately assume it's a ghost, but nobody that has stepped foot in my childhood home has left it without believing in ghosts. We moved into the house when I was about 5 or 6, and at first nothing really happened. The very first time I had any idea was after a year or so. On this night, I was laying in bed in the middle of the night. I couldn't sleep. In my room, my bed is laid out in such a manner that the door is 90 degrees to my right as I'm laying down on my back. The door to my bedroom was open, as I'm from the south and we didn't have AC, so everyone had the windows open and the fans to let the house breathe. Anyway, as I'm laying there, unable to sleep, I turn my head to the right. Standing there in the doorway is the clear silhouette of a man. It did not have any features for me to see, just the outline. Even though I didn't see his face, I knew it was a man, and I knew that he was looking right at me. I froze in fear for what felt like an eternity, and eventually grabbed whatever was near to throw at the door to try to close it. I was unable to get it closed, so I eventually just rolled on my left side and hoped he would go away. Eventually, I got the courage to look, and he was gone, and I went back to sleep. That was just the beginning of my childhood paranormal encounters within the home. And to be clear, after growing up in the home, I now know the spirits in the house are not malicious or hurtful in any way. Sometimes they just want someone to know they're there and will make themselves known, but never in a bad way. It would break the app with the amount of stories I have about the house, but that is just the first one of many. From Redditor, you destroy all molemans. Let's set the scene. It's an island in the Philippines. Now you're probably imagining old growth forests and jungle, but the wilderness on this island was mostly palm forest and swampland, if one was pressed for classification. As you will find on most Visayan islands, there was a beachy resort area with a few tourists, lodgings of varying quality. Catering to the tourist at said establishment were rental places, renting out vehicles of even more varying quality. I, being young and therefore both poor and foolhardy, rented the cheapest Chinese-made dirt bike in the town. I used said dirt bike lightly for a day around the beach and in unwitting preparation for my great adventure the following day. A component in the brake had to be replaced at the shop. Now you see, I'd seen some maps and there was a second town, Town B, with a beach several hours distance away by a provincial highway. The highway itself took a large detour around the area of the forest, skirting the coast and keeping as far away from the area as possible without physically propelling yourself into the ocean. However, there was a map sneakily hidden in the darkest corner of a local restaurant that told a different story. The map was faded, as the mining or plantation venture it was produced for had long since folded, but behind the brown tinge in the 60s typography was the unmistakable dotted line of a trail cutting from one curve of the highway to another, eliminating half the distance. So the next morning I got up bright and early to drive to Town B, packing some beach gear and making sure not to pack something totally unnecessary like a torch. I trundled along the highway for a little while, being passed at breakneck speeds by trucks and jeeps belching black smoke, until I turned my truck off. The initial part of the secondary road was cement, good sign, and I followed it through some villages. Rice paddies gave way to more and more palm trees, and the road itself became gravel. With every passing mile, the houses became scarier, the palm trees became denser, and the road became wetter. More rutted, more orange with clay. Roughly 90 minutes passed between the final house I saw on the side and the first one I saw on the other. The road itself was literally walking track in width for a good 45
of those minutes. All mud and rock, with deep drainage marks crisscrossing the surface, puddles elsewhere. One pool was almost an engine killer in depth and length, and required a lot of coaxing to get the bike not to suffocate. I was absolutely filthy. My wrists and biceps were aching. My teeth were almost rattled out of my gums. But I had made good time, and it was not even noon yet when I reached town B. Going from A to B had been a complete success. So as you can imagine, I strutted around the beach all afternoon with the smuggest expression humanly possible. Anyway, during the afternoon, I decided I could backtrack through the same route because I'd done it once. And if you do something once, you can definitely do it again. By the time I reached the last house on the side of town B, it was late afternoon. Logically, I sped up because the secret to avoiding the dangers of reduced visibility is to outrun it. Now, the back of the bike was bouncing around like wild, but I was making good time. That was until a part that was fixed the previous day gave way again. Of course, that wasn't immediately clear at the time. What it felt like was the bike making a hard right into the foliage, while I clung out with one hand until the side of the bike went thunk into the tree and thunked me off into the mire. I went flying one way, landing on my back, and the bike went bouncing another, landing quite miraculously on the road, or however you describe it. I don't know if you're meant to pass out after that kind of thing, because my body did the opposite, and I basically flung myself on the bike to get it upright. Unfortunately, adrenaline can only do so much, and I soon felt this ridiculously intense throbbing rising from my right leg. My kneecap took full force of the tree trunk, and basically all the skin was hanging off. Bone and muscle was not visible, but a lump of skin about the size of my palm was hanging down, and the kneecap itself was visibly strange. Later I learned it was fractured in several places. I fell on my ass when I realized the enormity of being absolutely unable to walk the distance necessary to get help. Amazingly, the bike motor was still running, and although basically the brake pedal and the protrusions on the right side were bent up against the bike, and every piece of bodywork was hanging off. The only fundamental problem with the bike was the broken rear axle. In a stroke of luck that could only have come from a divine power, the axle rod that had been taken out of the bike the previous day was still in the tool set provided in the storage. I know it sounds contrived, but rather than fix the issue, the owner had replaced one axle with an even older axle, taken 5 to do so, and put the existing and pretty much fine one back in the toolkit. In the last light of the day, I took apart the rear of the bike and replaced it with parts as best I could with my limited knowledge of motorcycles. By now, dusk was becoming night. I still had what was 1 hour of driving during the day to complete, and my leg was pretty much stained red with blood and pretty much immovable. It took a good while and a good deal of struggling to even mount the bike. However, practically everything else was hand operated, including the ignition, so it was drivable. Drivable in a sense because the lights were broken and it was pitch black rainforest, covered in puddles and rocks and vines. In hindsight, it may have been smarter to wait the night, but I gunned the throttle and started moving as slow as was possible without stalling. Now the night happened to be clear and the moon was gigantic, so there was a slight but noticeable amount of light shining down on the road. The human eye is amazing when it comes to that, and every passing minute, moving at walk pace, the path became clearer. This means one vaguely lighter shade of gray compared to another, but it was enough to avoid rolling off the beaten track too often or making further thunks against trees. Throttle idle, more throttle, pure rock, idle. Really ridiculously slow for hours, until I hit the largest puddle that I'd met last time. This was quite visible, with the moon reflecting off of it. I wasn't really in any position to push the bike across, so I crossed my fingers and let the bike roll in and drove as straight as possible. All was fine until the last meters of the puddle, where to my horror, there was a patch of deep mud I had avoided before. The rear wheel got stuck deep. My leg is destroyed, so there's no way I can brace myself and manhandle the bike out. Having come so far, I got absolutely animalistic and forced all my weight forward on the handlebars, while gunning the throttle as hard as it will go on the lowest gear. The bike starts to smell like burning, but gradually the rear wheel wrenches itself forward and slide out of the deep mud with all the fury of an old-timey deity they'd sacrificed children to. And then I tipped over, face first, into some shallow mud. Anyway, it got easier from there, and at about 5 a.m., I dragged my sorry muddy ass through the gates of a local clinic who patched me up, and then called an ambulance that took me to an even better clinic. The owner settled the damage for literally $50 because the dodgy bike repair was obviously to blame, and he didn't want to be chewed out or extorted by the police. Destroy all mole mans. Escape in a jungle by biking with a broken leg.
Posted by Galsko. Okay, so this will probably be my first and last post in this sub, as I am a non-believer, or was. The story goes back as long as I can remember, all back to my childhood, and I can't say for sure when exactly it started. Also, sorry if my English is bad, it's not my native language. My bedroom used to be on the first floor, just next to the front door. Next to the front door, we had 2 large windows, going all the way to the floor, on both sides. And I had a normal window in my bedroom, facing the same direction. In front of my window, I had some very sheer curtains in white, and next to the front door, there were no curtains. My bed was situated across from my door, with my bed facing away from the window. My pillow would approximately be 1 meter from the window. Anyway, what would sometimes happen was that I could hear footsteps, clear and loud footsteps, coming from one side of the front towards my window. Then the sound would abruptly stop, and sometimes I could also see the shape of a rather tall and big-built man outside my window. It was hard to say exactly how big, but from the shape I would say taller than a normal man, but with the same build. As a child, I used to compare the shape with Jaws from James Bond, as he had a similar shape and was very tall. Now, this sometimes happened, and my brother had his room across from me, but he barely slept there, as he was scared of the dark. Eventually, my dad moved there when he was snoring. My brother hasn't heard anything that he can remember, but he also moved upstairs before he hit his teens. This happened frequently, and several nights I would lay still for at least an hour or so, unable to move, as I was completely paralyzed with fright, thinking if I just lay still, the thing outside my window will either think my bed is empty or that I am sleeping and just go away. Eventually, I started to doubt myself and what I was seeing myself. As I had been told so many times, it was probably just my imagination. I opted to try to catch it in the act and tried to put something in front of the window in advance and then peek out in the hallway to see if I could see something walking past, but nothing. I also tried to use my web camera to record through the whole night, but never caught anything interesting. I tried to tell my parents, but they kept telling me it was my imagination, and that I either was having a bad dream or my imagination was just taking it too far. Now, in their defense, I have a pretty vivid imagination and have been scared of lots of things that don't exist before, but I've never before or after heard or seen anything except for this walking man. And then there was this one night. I was sitting up chatting with online friends, and the time was about 3 a.m. I remember the time because I freaked out about it being 3 a.m. after watching The Exorcist for the first time. When there was someone trying to open the front door, 3 times they pushed down the handle, and I almost peed myself. I remember telling the group I was chatting with, thinking in case I die or something, police will find out what happened. After waiting for a bit, I ran over to the opposite room and woke my dad up, who I was happy was in that room that night. He didn't believe me and said I had been having a bad dream, but I had been completely awake and didn't even feel a bit sleepy. But after a bit, he agreed to come with me and brought a flashlight to see out the windows. Nothing nowhere. Then I moved away, and when I got back to visit my parents, I was wondering if I would still hear the steps, but I didn't. They had stopped, but I could never completely relax in that bed. Should maybe also add that when it was winter and snowy outside, I didn't just hear the footsteps, but the snow against shoe sound also, which just made it more real. But the next day, there wouldn't necessarily be additional shoe prints. So I want to add, we did not live in any city or something. I could walk into dense forest after taking about 30 steps. Now a friend I told this to said it might be a ghost or something, possibly looking after me. And at that time, I started to believe that story. Because a ghost, even if it was scary, was less scary than the alternatives. Now I'm not really sure what to believe. Was it a ghost? Was it a person? Or was I hallucinating? Or something for over 15 years? The man outside my window. Posted by Flaxen Flare.
Before I start, here's a bit of context to my story. My husband and I lived in a small 2-floor house with 2 main entrances, one along the front and the other on the side of the house, which opens up into the laundry room. When we were too busy or it's too late to walk our dogs, we hook its collar onto a lawn line that's attached to one of the pipes on the corners of our house so we could use the bathroom. We used to do this from the door in our laundry room, but we noticed the large step from the door to the ground had been taking a toll on his hip. As a result, we started letting him out through the front door instead, since the porch is much closer to the ground. This particular night, I was home alone with my dog. It was around midnight when I decided to let him outside one last time before going to bed. I hook him up to his line, close the door, and lock it before heading into the kitchen to put away the dishes. This was pretty routine. If he used the bathroom quickly, he liked to walk around along the front inside of the house for a few minutes before coming back inside. As I'm putting away the dishes, I hear a scratch on the door. How my dog signals he wants to come back inside. So I head over to him to let him back in. Since I've watched way too many scary movies, I always look through the door's peephole before opening the door. Out of habit, I look to check the dog is in the front door. That I see a man staring very intently at the door handle. I freeze with my hand on the door handle. I don't know how much time went by, but then I heard another scratch. This one, louder than the last. It kind of wakes me up from my initial shock, and I run to grab my cell phone. I call my husband to tell him what's happening. He was very confused. I probably wasn't explaining the situation very well, but says that he's heading home. This is when I realized my dog is still outside with this person. I head back to the front door, trying to make as little noise as possible to check whether the stranger is still there. Just like before, he's standing there, head bowed, looking at the doorknob. I tiptoe over to the laundry room and slowly open the door as quietly as possible. I can't see my dog anywhere, and the side of the house is covered in gravel. I knew I couldn't step outside without making a lot of noise. With my heart still pounding in my chest, I go to the front door to keep an eye on the stranger and to get a better look at him. I consider calling the police, but I didn't feel they would take me seriously. Since all this man was doing was standing in front of my house, I tried taking a picture of him with my cell phone, but my camera was only able to take pictures of the people and not the images behind the glass. All of a sudden, the man looks up directly at me. I swear he knew I was there. He glares at me, then opens his mouth to show the taunting, malicious grin. He stood there, that way, for a few seconds. With that, he turns around and starts to walk down the street. I stay in the same place, almost expecting him to rush back, start pounding on the door. Luckily, my husband got back after a few minutes. Long story short, he convinced me to call the police, and we went out looking for our dog. Turns out this man had cut the end of our line connected to the pipe, and our dog had decided this was a good time for him to explore my neighborhood backyard, which was where we found him. It's been 3 years since this happened. We've since moved to a new house, unrelated reasons, and the police weren't able to come up with any suspect. Ever since then, we take our dog on very long walk before the sun goes down. Posted by Flaxen Flare. A man pretended to be the family dog. A violent psychopath is playing a twisted mind game with me, and I want him to stop. If I had known that placing an innocuous free ad on the internet website would earn me a stalker, and a psychopathic one at that, I would never have done it. But being struggling freelance graphic designer without a steady line of work and limited financial resources, I took advantage of the opportunity and went ahead and posted it. It was just a 2-line thing that included my trading name and email address, published on the major trade sites. It didn't give me the extra work I'd been hoping for, but it did give me something else, an unbelievable amount of unsolicited emails from people in the same boat as myself, struggling graphic designers desperately chasing work. And in the following months, I received close to 2,000 emails from people looking for employment. Initially, I responded to all of them and made it clear that I wasn't hiring at the current stage, nor that I was in the position to outsource any projects. But once the number of the emails started hitting the triple digits, I stopped. After all, it wasn't like I had placed a job ad. Besides, it was just too time consuming, and I had other things to do. But still, the emails kept pouring in, between 10 to 15 each day, and because they were sent to my official company account, I had to open them. I only gave them a quick perusal, just enough time to establish what it was about, before deftly transferring them over to my electronic trash can. There was, however, one email that stood out, in which I did respond to. It was a long 700 or 800 word piece written by a guy in a neighboring state. The email described the problem the guy was having securing jobs, and how increasingly difficult it was to keep his daughter in college. He had even attached a picture of himself, and I remember thinking,
that he had a friendly face, that kind you would expect to find on a nice older uncle or grandfather. The guy was looking straight at the camera, with big blue cozy eyes and a warm kind smile on his lips. By all appearances, he was Mr. Friendly himself. And because I wasn't the type of person who was comfortable letting people down, I knew I had to respond to it. It was almost like getting a letter from an old friend or classmate. So, I sat back in my chair and started tapping on the keyboard. I didn't spend too much time on it, only a couple of minutes. Enough to let the guy know that I sympathized with the situation, but that, unfortunately, I didn't have any work to offer him. I did it in the nicest way possible, and ended the email by wishing the guy all the best in the future. Then I clicked send, and forgot all about it, and started working on a project for a car hire company that had approached me a few weeks prior. A few hours later, just as I was about to run down to the local cafe to grab something to eat, I received a reply from that old guy. In it, he thanked me for his email and told me that he totally understood and thanked me for his time. I read it, closed it, and thought that was the last time I would hear from that guy. But that didn't turn out to be the case. The next morning, when I opened my Facebook app, I saw the guy had subscribed to my company page. I thought it was a bit strange, but didn't think too much of it. The guy was probably just doing some networking. Hell, I was definitely guilty of that myself. In this economy, you had to do whatever you could to try and land a gig, so I pushed it to the back of my mind. But after a couple of days, when the guy began commenting on my post, it got a little bit weird. At first, it was just a few innocent lines here and there, congratulating me on the various projects I had completed and posted samples of on my Facebook page. I didn't particularly mind, but when the messages just kept coming, not to mention increased in frequency, I started to worry. There was something unsettling about the comments. It was like the guy wanted me to respond to him and thank him for his feedback. And I got the distinct impression that if the feedback wasn't to the guy's liking, he was apt to fly off the handle. The message oozed passive aggressiveness. This continued for about a week, and in the end, I realized that I had to put my foot down. So I sent the guy a private message, politely asking him to stop commenting on my Facebook page. I wrote that message late in the evening, and after sending it, I hoped it would be the end of that. But unfortunately, it was the start of something more sinister. And when I did my usual social media round the following morning, I got the shock of a lifetime. I was sitting at the kitchen table, slightly bent forward, a coffee mug in my left hand and my smartphone in the other. I had just opened my Facebook notification page and discovered that more than 40 new comments had appeared overnight. And as far as I could tell, they all seemed to come from the same guy. I clicked on the first one and felt my gut turn into ice. The guy had left a 3-paragraph comment laden with profanities and the vilest language that I had ever seen. I was absolutely stunned, and I raised my head up from the screen and looked out the window for a couple of seconds, and then I shook my head, as if I had just imagined it, before returning my attention to the phone again. But unfortunately, I hadn't. The horrible comments were still there. I quickly clicked through the notifications and discovered that the guy had left comments on every single post for that month, and they were just as disgusting as the first one. And in addition to the despicable abuse directed at me personally, the guy had copied and pasted highly defamatory statement and attached it to the end of each vile rant. It read, quote, "George Stevens is an effing a-hole and a liar. He's been stealing my work and harassing me and my family for months now. George, I hope you die, you effing piece of shit." End quote. I was thoroughly taken aback, but I accidentally knocked the red coffee mug that I had placed in front of me on the table, and hot coffee spilled out in all directions. Some of it ended up on my lap, and I jumped up out of my chair and swore loudly. Then after I had finished dancing around, I slumped back down in the chair again and just sat there staring at the screen. My mind was operating in shell shock mode, and there was only one thought bouncing around in my brain, and that was, what the F would my clients and friends think when they saw this? Would I lose some of the contracts that I had been working so hard to secure because of this? I was close to panicking, and it took quite a few deep breaths to try to calm myself. Then my survival instinct kicked in, and I did what I should have done straight away, namely block the guy from accessing my Facebook page. After that was taken care of, I started going through the offensive posts and deleting the comments. It took me a good 5 minutes to go through it all, and once that was sorted out, I started to feel a little bit more at ease. It was still early in the morning, and with a little bit of luck, no one else would have seen it. I seriously contemplated sending the guy an email,
telling him exactly what I thought of his behavior, but I decided against it. The guy had obvious mental issues, and I didn't want to aggravate the situation any further. The last thing I needed in my life right now was a cyberspace psycho stalking me on social media sites. Once was more than enough. And it did appear to be the correct choice of strategy, because for the next few days, I didn't hear anything from the old weirdo. And as the week drew to a close, I was convinced that that was the end of it. But that all changed 2 weeks later when I was walking out of my local Woolworth store. It was early in the evening, and I had spent 12 hours straight in front of the computer working on a very demanding rebranding project. I was tired and was pushing the trolley without paying too much attention to my surroundings. I was heading toward the pedestrian crossing that would take me to the parking lot on the other side. A few moments before I arrived, I noticed a black Volvo approaching. I didn't pay much attention to it and continued walking toward the crossing, assuming that the car would stop. And a few seconds later, I began making my way across the 2-lane road that separated the parking lot from the supermarket. But the car wasn't slowing down. As a matter of fact, it accelerated. The sudden roar of the engine got my attention, and I threw my head around and stared at it. It was less than 15 yards away now, and coming straight at me, fast. And I was growing a sense of horror. I realized that it wasn't going to stop. I felt the adrenaline rush into my system, and my muscles tense. I was a third of the way across the road and wasn't going to make it over to the other side in time. I yanked the trolley violently and started running back towards the curb, but the car kept bearing down on me, and I was convinced that it would hit me. I would break every bone in my body and spend the next month in a hospital. I increased my speed and threw myself toward the sidewalk and managed to get out of the way just as the car roared past. I threw my head around and was about to hurl some well-deserved profanities at the driver. When I locked eyes with him, I froze and felt an ice-cold shiver run down my spine. I recognized the face instantly. In fact, I'd been looking into that very same face a few weeks earlier when I had been going through my unsolicited emails. It was the guy that had left the hateful comments on my Facebook page. There was no mistaking it. The guy was leaning out of the driver's side window and staring straight at me with hatred in his eyes. His left arm was extended, and I could see that he was flipping me the bird. I stared at him, open-mouthed, as the car disappeared down the road and continued toward traffic lights in the main road beyond it. "Hey, are you okay, mister?" A young mother with a child strapped in the seat of a shopping trolley looked at me with deep concern in her face. I nodded to indicate that I was, and the young mother turned her attention to the departing Volvo. Then she looked back at me and shook her head. "That guy almost ran you over," she said. "You were lucky that he didn't hit you." "Yes, I guess I was," I responded, feebly and without much conviction. "That could have been us," the young woman said, as she squeezed her little guy's hand tightly. I looked at them briefly and thought that her suspicion was unfounded. The guy was after me, not them, but I didn't say it. Instead, I turned my head and kept looking towards traffic lights in the distance. The young mother remained where she was for a few more seconds, half expecting me to say something, but when I didn't, she quickly moved along. In the end, no one had been hurt, and it wasn't like she didn't have other things to do. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I started moving again. My entire body was shaking, and I was covered in sweat. I kept glancing around nervously, making sure that the nutter wasn't coming back again for a second try. When I got to my car, I quickly placed the groceries in the trunk and got inside and sat there for a long time, thinking about what the hell just happened. I had been so stunned to look at the license plate. There was no way I could report the incident to the police. Likewise, in my haste to get rid of the vile comments from my Facebook page, I deleted the only evidence linking the two of us. If I decided to report it to the police, they wouldn't be able to do anything. I had no proof of any wrongdoing. It would be my word against his. In the end, I reluctantly decided not to do anything, but that would change if the guy had tried to do something else, and I hoped with all my heart that he wouldn't. I leaned forward and turned the key in the ignition and made my way out of the parking lot. I took the long way home, constantly looking in the rearview mirror to make sure I wasn't being followed, and when I arrived at my house, 20 minutes later, I felt slightly more at ease. I hadn't seen the black Volvo again, and I was sure that no one else had been tailing me. But I was still apprehensive, and I gave the area a quick 360-degree swap before I closed the car door behind me. Then I wiped the sweat from my forehead and got the 4 grocery bags out of the trunk before hurrying over to the back of the house. When I arrived at the screen door, I set the bags down, put my hand in my pocket, and grabbed the house key and inserted it into the lock. and just as I did so, I heard a sound behind me. It was the sound of something moving very rapidly, and I was only able to turn halfway around before something crashed into my head and everything went dark. When I came to, I noticed that I was lying on something cold and hard. The second thing I noticed was that I had a terrible headache. The side of my head felt like it had been run over by a semi-truck. I let out a low grunt and slowly got up to my knees, and then I started shaking my head like a boxer who had just recovered from a severe blow to the skull. After a few seconds of utter confusion, the thought of what had happened to me earlier that day started to come back, and I began wondering where the hell I was. When I got back up on my feet, I realized that I was inside some type of cylindrical structure. I looked around and saw that it was a concrete storage tank. It was dark in there, and the only light I could see came from a faint source somewhere beyond the top of the structure. The tank had been at least 10 foot or so from the top to bottom, and I was wondering how the hell I'd ended up here. Then I noticed the handcuff around my right hand, and my heart skipped a beat. I looked down at it, dumbfounded, and shook my head a few more times, and then I closed my eyes briefly before opening them again. But my mind wasn't playing any tricks on me. I was handcuffed. I let my eyes wander over to my side and saw the other end of the handcuff was attached to a chain fixed to a metal plate secured firmly to the tank's concrete base. Then my mind finally kicked into gear, and I remember seeing the psycho that had left all of the hateful comments on my Facebook page outside the Woolworth store. I felt the blood rush out of my head and accumulate somewhere in my lower body. Effing nutcase must have assaulted me, drugged me, and placed me at the bottom of a goddamn well. I yanked at the chain, but the only thing I achieved was to inflict a sharp pain in my wrist. I let my right hand slide down to my side, and instead raised my left hand up to my head and winced when I felt the big lump just behind my ear. Holy crap, the guy must have whacked me really good. Then another thought entered my mind. The cell phone. All I had to do was dial 911. The police would come and get me. I thrust my hand into my pocket and received yet another shock. The phone wasn't there. I checked the other pockets, but it wasn't there either. Then I threw myself down and began checking the floor, thinking it must have fallen out when I was laying down. But it was nowhere to be found. The son of a bee had taken it. I jumped back up again and began kicking the wall. Then I looked up and started shouting, "Hey, get me out of here, you effing psycho. I know who you are." I waited a few seconds, but there was no reply. "Hey, can you hear me? Sick F? Get me the hell out of here. You'll be really effing sorry." The threat sounded hollow, but it was the only thing I could think of there and then. A few seconds passed, and then I heard something. It was a long, gushing sound. The moments later, I saw water starting washing over the edge and run down the side of the wall, and that's when panic set in. I was chained to the bottom of the tank, and someone had just opened a tap that had the capacity to fill the tank all the way to the top with water. And the handcuff and chain would see to it that I remained at the bottom, unable to escape. I was trapped and about to die. I started hyperventilating and began screaming from the top of my lungs at the same time as I started yanking at the chain attached to the floor, but it wasn't going anywhere. It was a thick steel chain, and the metal plate it was attached to was secured with the heavy-duty expansion bolts. It didn't take long for the tears to appear, and I could feel them streaming down my cheeks. My vision became blurry, and my chest started to hurt. I lifted my head again and gazed up at the opening and began to plead, "Please, please let me out of here. I promise I'll do whatever you want. Just please get me the F out of here." But no one answered, so I started swearing again. I used the most profane language I could think of and cursed the effing psycho and his retarded family, but still, there was no reaction, only silence coming from beyond the tank. By now, the water had started to accumulate at the bottom and had risen to my shoelaces. The water was ice cold, but the temperature didn't bother me. I was too shell-shocked to notice its frigid sting. Then I heard someone moving around, somewhere on the top, and moments later, something was thrown down to me. It made a light splashing sound as it hit the water, and I turned my attention away from the opening and looked down at the object that was now resting a few inches away from my feet. It appeared to be a knife tucked inside of a sheath. Then a deep voice called down to me, and what it said sent an ice cold shiver down my spine. "Hey asswipe, how far are you willing to go to save your own life? Are you willing to do whatever it takes?" I jerked my head back again, but I was unable to see anyone there. Then the silence returned. The psycho had said his piece and left me to contemplate my options. I lowered my head and stared at the knife with terror-stricken eyes.
I even moved a few steps away from it, as if it was a deadly viper ready to strike. And then, oh, so slowly my eyes were drawn toward the right hand inside of the handcuff. I had been given a choice, a horrible choice. Cut my hand off and live, or leave it where it was and die an agonizing death. I lost it completely and started hammering my fist against the concrete sides and cursing the sick psycho that had put me in this horrible situation, as it did, so the water kept rising. By now, it was halfway up to my calves. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, but it seemed to be having any effect. I slapped my face a few times and told myself to get my shit together, and then I looked down again at the area where the knife had landed. The water had obscured it, and I had to feel around with my hands for a few seconds before I was able to locate it. When I found it, I snatched it. It stood back up again, and then I slowly pulled it out of the sheath with trembling hands. It was an almost exact replica of the knife Sylvester Stallone had popularized in the film First Blood. It had a serrated edge on the top for sawing and a razor-sharp edge for cutting on the other. I looked at it for a long time before closing my eyes again. There was no way in hell I'd be able to cut my own hand. I looked down at my wrist again and felt the water trickling my knees. Another 20 minutes and I'd be dead unless I took some drastic measures to prevent it. I swallowed hard and felt the sweat running down my forehead and into my eyes. I quickly wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket, and then I put my knife against my wrist and took a few deep breaths, closed my eyes again, and did absolutely nothing. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't cut my own hand. There was something hardwired into my brain that prevented me from amputating anything attached to my body. I let out a deep, primal scream and started banging on the concrete wall again. The more tears started streaming down my cheeks. Was this how I was gonna die? Chained to the bottom of a well like a sick animal? This wasn't the way things were supposed to play out. I was only 27 years old. There were so many things that I hadn't done yet. By now, the water was almost touching my hips, and the temperature was starting to affect me. I was shaking, and for a few moments, I feared I was going to lose grip on the knife. I took a few more deep breaths, healed myself, and placed the knife against my wrist for the second time. Then I closed my eyes again, willing myself to cut it off, telling myself it was the only way out. But still, I just couldn't go ahead with it. I cried some more tears and felt defeat wash over me like a raging torrent. I was going to die in less than 10 minutes. And I was just gonna stand there and wait for it to happen. What a effing loser I was. And all the while, the water continued to rise. First up to my stomach, and then up to my chest. And now, I was really starting to panic. I yanked at the chain like a madman, but the metal plate on the bottom of the tank held strong. I would never relinquish its grip. When the water reached my chin, I stood up on my toes, and when it reached my mouth, I began treading the water. There were a couple of inches of slack left in the chain, but soon I wouldn't be able to keep my head above water, and that would be the end of George Stevens. The water continued to rise, and soon there was no more slack left in the chain. I tilted my head back in a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable. I was treading the water like crazy and could feel it touch my lower lip. And I knew I had to do it. I had to cut my own hand. I filled my lungs with as much air as I could, managed to inhale, held my breath, and ducked below the dark surface. The only way out now was to discard my hand. I stared at it through the dark water and saw the other hand, holding the knife, move the sharp instrument toward it. And then I felt an unbearable pain in my right wrist and saw blood starting to seep out just above the handcuff and slowly fan out around it like weightless red dye. The pain was excruciating. But still, the hand controlling the knife kept going. It cut and sliced through the tendons, veins, and ligaments connecting it to the rest of the arm. I feared I was going to pass out, but I managed to keep going. By now, my lungs were ready to burst, and I knew I wouldn't be able to stay under the water for very much longer. I moved the knife back and forth a few more times, and then I yanked my right arm hard against the handcuff, but the arm was still connected to the hand. I yanked it one more time, then a second time, and then on the third attempt, it finally came loose. My lungs were screaming for air. I kicked desperately for my legs and broke through the surface as I exhaled the spent oxygen. I took a deep breath and then lifted my right arm up to my face and saw the bloody stump where my hand had been less than a minute before. Then I screamed like I never screamed before, the sound waves echoing between the concrete walls and my hurting ears. At some point after that, probably no more than a half minute or so, my brain kicked into autopilot mode, and I began removing my jacket and t-shirt. It was difficult, especially now that I only had one hand, but with some effort, I managed to place a makeshift tourniquet around my lower arm and wrap my t-shirt over the exposed stump. A minute later, I pulled myself out of the tank, and as I did so, I noticed the spotlight that had lit up the area go out, but I paid no attention to it. I was too focused on crossing the clearing in the forest and disappearing into the tree line. I got up to my feet and ran as fast as I could, never looking back once. I just kept running. The only thing on my mind was getting as far away as possible and getting out of this nightmare alive. It was pitch black and impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me, but I could sense the trees getting closer and closer, and then I felt hard branches scrape against my body and my feet, finding slightly firmer footing, but I didn't slow down, and I kept running until I had no more strength left in my body. And then I fell to the ground, completely spent, and closed my eyes. I just needed a little break, just a little rest before I got back up again. Next time I opened my eyes, I was lying in a hospital bed. I sat up, looked around the room, fearing that I was still trapped. But when the door swung open a few minutes later and a nurse and doctor entered the room, I started to relax. There were bandages wrapped around my wrist, and a sinister-looking cannula inserted into my vein, just below my elbow. I immediately started bombarding them with questions, but they were evasive, and instead of answering me, focused on assessing my wounded lower arm. The doctor kept telling me, relax, and eventually told the nurse to give me a sedative, which she did. Then a few minutes later, I drifted off to sleep again. The next day, a beefy police officer pulled up a chair next to my bed, sat down, and began filling me in on the details, and what he told me was almost as unsettling as ending up in the bottom of the tank. A police patrol had found me passed out on the shoulder of the road just outside the city limits. Upon further inspection, and after having established that my injuries were slightly more serious than your average flesh wound, they had called an ambulance, which had transported me to the nearest hospital. You were in a semi-conscious state, the police officer told me. You were rambling on about a clearing in the forest and a tank, and how you had been forced to cut off your own hand. The paramedics listened to you, and when they arrived at the hospital, they relayed the information to the police officers on site. They then proceeded to search your clothes to see if they could find any ID, which they didn't. They did, however, find a few rocks of crystal meth, which prompted the doctor to take some blood samples. The beefy officer gave me a bland look, and as they suspected, you tested positive for the drug. The officer cleared his throat. Thus, based on the available evidence, we reached the conclusion that you cut off your own hand in a drug-fueled rage. I felt my jaw drop. I know this must be painful for you to hear, the police officer continued, but nevertheless, that is what we believe took place. Then he shifted his position in the chair and added, you'd be surprised if you knew all the things that meth addicts get up to when they're under the influence. I've seen people jump out of windows in high-rise apartments and throw themselves out of moving cars. I've also seen addicts stabbing themselves. It's an awful drug, and you shouldn't be messing around with it, son. But I've never used any type of drugs. I haven't even tried pot. I looked helplessly at the officer. I was one of those stray kids that I always said no. But it didn't do any good. I could see that he didn't believe me. Instead, he went on about how they had searched for the clearing in the forest and how they had been unable to locate it, and in the end, they had concluded that I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew what had happened, and it was most definitely not a figment of my imagination. It had been all too real. I had been placed in the bottom of a tank, and I had been forced to do something no human being should ever have to be forced to do, but I couldn't prove it. And to add to my woes, a prohibited drug had been injected into my system to discredit me and to make sure the cops treated me as a questionable witness. The Facebook psycho had planned it well. I had to give him that. A few minutes later, the guy stood up, gave me a quick nod, and left the room, and that was the end of the matter. As far as the police were concerned, the nutter had gone away with it. A few months passed, and I had to make quite a few adjustments. Because of my newly acquired handicap, I was no longer able to work as a graphics designer. Without the right hand, it was simply not possible. It was probably why the guy had chosen to cut off the right hand instead of the left. I tried to figure out why the guy had become so upset when I had asked him to stop communicating me on the Facebook page, and why he had chosen me. But I was unable to come up with any meaningful answer, because such an answer didn't exist. I was also wondering if I was the guy's first and only victim. I guess I would never find out. And in the end, I was just glad that I had survived. All these thoughts were running through my mind. One Thursday afternoon, I was going outside to check the mail. The thoughts were distracting me, and that's probably why I didn't see the black Volvo until it was less than 20 yards away. It slowed down next to me, and I could see the window on the driver's side being lowered. I felt a jolt run through my body, and I stopped dead in my tracks. My eyes were locked onto the person driving the car. He was only in his early 60s, and he had a fake bandage soaked in red dye wrapped around the lower section of his right arm. And as he passed my house, he leaned out of the window and looked over at me. "Hey, how's the hand, asswipe? You better be more respectful in the future. If you don't, you might just lose the other one too." It was the Facebook stalker, the guy that had chained me to the bottom of the tank, the guy who had me cut off my own hand. I stood there, completely petrified, between the mailbox and the entrance door, watching the car make its way toward the end of the street. And as it cleared the corner and disappeared out of my view, I felt an icy lump form in my stomach. And then the shaking started. The guy is not done yet, I thought. He won't stop until I've drawn my last breath. Then I collapsed to the ground and felt the darkness wrap itself around me, and hoped with all my heart that when I woke up, it would turn out that it was all just a bad dream.